Welcome back to the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Last time, Samuel spent time in Kingston, Jamaica, selling freight and trying to procure freight back to England. Between death from yellow fever, garbage surrounding the wharf, and his crew absconding, Samuel's time was less than enjoyable, and he was not disappointed to set sail for England, on which journey we find him now. On the 28th of May, 1795, at 4 o'clock in the morning, having previously obtained a Negro pilot from Port Royal, after laying in Jamaica nearly 7 months, and had not a wise and watchful Providence undertaken my preservation, I had doubtless descended into the regions of the King of Terrors in a polluted and sinful land. On the 29th, at daylight, we joined many ships, and at noon anchored at Blue Fields. This bay is surrounded by sloping high land, well cultivated, and exhibiting delightful scenery. There is a small town on the beach with a fine stream of excellent water from the mountains. Soon after we anchored, canoes with livestock came alongside, from which we purchased a few hogs and fowls, and I obtained a quarter of beef from an overseer of a plantation, who informed me the mortality amongst the whites had been so great in this neighborhood that the estates were distressed for want of overseers and bookkeepers. The 31st at noon we saw the convoy with the Kingston ships in the offing, but for want of wind could not reach our anchorage. At 8 p.m. a boat arrived from Admiral Ford in the Europa, requesting the ships in Bluefields Bay would follow him to Negril Bay, where he intended collecting the whole of the merchantmen from both sides of the island. My mate was very urgent for me to allow him to bring on board a puncheon or two of rum for smuggling into Britain, but I would not admit of it. At 5 p.m. I ordered the anchor to be lifted, but the mate and crew refused to do anything till I gave notes for the run money. The mate, I found, was at the head of the mutiny, and was a most barefaced rogue in grain. He went to his cabin and continued obstinate till he obliged me to give him a note for 50 guineas, and each of the crew required a note for 45 guineas, which I was obliged to comply with before I could get up anchor and join the fleet. What a lamentable thing it is that the legislature has not found means to put a period to this evil, which has existed year after year for quite half a century, to the great distress of shipping and to the incalculable loss of the shipowners. Ever since I can remember, it has been the practice of English seamen to sign articles to remain by the ship to the West Indies and back to Britain without the least intention to perform their contract. They obtain 2 months' advance before they sail from England, and consequently on their arrival in the islands they have no wages due, and take the first opportunity to desert to obtain the customary runs from all distressed ships. The money my crew was now to have for conducting the ship to London was the enormous sum of £383 5 shillings sterling, whereas their monthly wages would have only amounted to the sum of £86 18 shillings 9 pennies. Each of my seamen was now to have 45 guineas, the greatest part of which would probably be spent in drunkenness and debauchery, to the great injury of soul and body. And though I was the subject of all the anxiety and trouble in navigating and directing the ship, I was obliged to be content with a quarter part of a seaman's wage, viz. Only £5 per month for the passage to England, with my constitution irreparably ruined by the hardships of the voyage. On the 1st of June at 1 p.m., having got under sail, we had to beat to windward to clear Bluefields Bay, and the next morning joined the Admiral to leeward of Negril Point. On the 2nd at 2 p.m., I went on board the Europa for instructions for which I paid the clerk, I think, $3. At 9 a.m. the fleet made sail for Europe, being 120 merchantmen under convoy of the Europa and Bellaquay 2-deckers, Magician frigate, and Swan sloop of war. The 3rd we experienced squally weather with rain. We got our derrick spar lashed across our stern to prevent being boarded by the enemy's privateers frequenting the coast of Cuba. The 4th we saw the island of Grand Cayman. The 5th at 5 p.m. we were about 5 miles from the southwest end of the Cayman, and the leeward ships procured many green turtle from the boats belonging to the island. Before sunset, a heavy squall came on, which split our foretop sail in pieces. The night was very dark with rain, thunder, and lightning, and the fleet lay to. At midnight made sail, the wind having settled to the eastward. As we passed the Grand Cayman, we saw a ship on shore on the west side of the island. We were obliged to bend another topsail. The 6th of June we had pleasant weather. Under a supposition that all was not right on deck, I left my bed about midnight, and found the mate and every person in his watch asleep, the wind being light. I took the liberty of rolling the officer from the hen coop down on deck, to his great astonishment. The 7th and 8th we saw some high land on Cuba within the Isle of Pines. The 9th the wind was light. This day we caught a shark 6 feet in length, with a dolphin fishhook and part of the line in his stomach. The 11th at meridian we got about 5 leagues to the westward of Cape Antonio, being the west point of Cuba. We had light winds till the 15th. At midnight heard several guns fired for assistance to leeward. At daylight saw the Beluque towing a transport without a bowsprit, she having carried it away by running on board another vessel in the night. Found a current setting to the northwest. The 16th at meridian, the notch of the Coxcomb Mountain in Cuba bore southeast, about 9 or 10 leagues from us. The 17th, seeing many ships with their colors in mourning, I imagined the yellow fever was still prevailing. One of our men, seeing a mattress bed floating near us, hooked it as a prize, but I made him throw it overboard again, being well convinced it had been the bed of a person who had died in the fever. At meridian, the Dolphin head on Cuba was in sight to the eastward. The winds continuing light, the fleet made little progress. On the 19th we had rain, thunder, and lightning. The 20th we had fresh breezes with frequent squalls. At 4 p.m. the lowland to the westward of the Havana bore southeast distant 4 leagues. At 2 a.m., having left my bed, I found the mate and all but 2 in his watch asleep, though the weather was boisterous. This day we broke our main topgallant yard. The 21st we got up a new topgallant yard. At 7 p.m. the fleet hove to till 1 a.m., when the wind shifted from the southward to northwest, when a signal was made for the fleet to veer and to lay to with their heads to the northward till daylight, when we made sail. At 6 a.m. the wind shifted to the eastward, and at meridian the admiral made the signal for seeing land on the Martyrs, which I imagine was about Key Low. We now entered what is properly called the main Florida stream, between the Bahama Islands and Florida reefs, the most dangerous part of this navigation. Sometimes the stream in this part runs like a torrent to northward, and its influence is felt far to the eastward of the banks of Newfoundland, and at times near the coast of Ireland. Want of due attention to this current occasions great errors in ships' reckonings, some vessels falling in with Ireland or England before expectation, and others bound to America looking out for a sight of that continent when they are 10 degrees to the eastward of it. During my continuance in the American trade, I paid a great deal of attention to this current. Near the coast of East Florida, I have experienced a drift of about 70 miles to the northward in 24 hours. But it runs weaker as it proceeds along the American coast, and runs much to the eastward off the Capes of Virginia, but is governed in its velocity by the different winds. To ascertain the direction of the current in general, I observed the direction of the streams of floating substances such as weeds, straw, feathers, etc. After taking the sun's altitude, and having ascertained the difference of northing or southing from our regular course steered, this difference in latitude and the course of the current enabled me to ascertain how many miles I had also been carried to the eastward, and this method corrected my reckoning amazingly. Sometimes, when the trade winds are strong for a considerable time together, the water accumulates in the Mexican Gulf, and rises very high, even to drown some of the Florida islands. It would be easy to erect poles or beacons on the principal parts of both sides of this labyrinth of rocks and islands, at a trifling expense, which would greatly conduce to the safety of shipping passing through the Florida Passage into the Atlantic Ocean. The 22nd, at 7 a.m., we saw 2 hummocks, or small round hills on the mainland of East Florida, about Dry Inlet. The sight of this land brought to my mind the days of slavery I had passed in this province whilst I assisted to the evacuation and belonged to the Jason transport. On Midsummer Day, we had a long passage through the Gulf. I put our crew on an allowance of provisions. This day, the 24th, spoke a brig belonging to Liverpool, one of the fleet. From the captain, I learned that one of the vessels under convoy had been captured by the French during our passage along the coast of Cuba. This day, we caught a dolphin. On the 27th at midnight, I again detected the mate asleep in his watch, he being much given to tippling. As the morning advanced, we experienced squally weather from the north, with rain, thunder, and lightning. As our ship sailed very bad, we had work enough to keep up with the fleet, being obliged to carry a press of sails which often caused their splitting. The 1st of July, the leech rope of the foretopsail gave way in 3 places, which we repaired aloft. 3 of the men of war had each a merchantman in tow this day. The third, my mate pretended that one of the puncheons of rum stowed in the steerage had leaked out many gallons, which caused me to examine the cask. I found the bung had been started since it was shipped, and I have little doubt but my mate knew the road to the spirit. At 9 p.m. I found him drunk on his watch and discovered that he had split some grog on the head of a cask of coffee stowed in the cabin. On examining our stock of water, we found a considerable deficiency by leakage. I therefore put all hands to an allowance of 2 quarts per diem. At meridian, there being no wind, the brig Elizabeth and Anne fell on board us and carried away our jib boom, and she gave us much trouble before we got her clear from our rigging. The 4th, we repaired our damage and got out a temporary jib boom, whilst the carpenter was making a new one. The 5th, we had squally weather from the eastward, saw a great many grampuses sporting around us. The 6th, we got out our new jib boom. On the 8th, we had fresh gales with frequent squalls and rain. At midnight, the wind shifted suddenly from southwest to northward, and as soon as we got our sails regulated, we heard 2 vessels firing distress guns. At daylight, the Bellaquay passed us with the ship Ocean of Bristol in tow, having lost her head and bowsprit by running on board the admiral's ship. On the 13th, the wind again shifted from the northwest to northeast, which brought our vessel from the rear to the van of the fleet and ahead of the admiral. But instead of shortening sail as required, I was determined to push on, being a heavy sailing vessel. But this breach of etiquette was soon corrected by shot from the Swan sloop. The 14th, we had moderate breezes and were far enough astern of the Commodore. The 15th, we had strong variable breezes with heavy rain, the admiral being out of sight ahead. At daylight, saw the Bellaquay astern and only 20 vessels in sight. At 8 a.m., the Bellaquay made sail ahead to endeavor to discover the admiral, and we carried a press of sail after her, which strained the ship so much as to require hourly pumping. The 16th, at 1 p.m., we experienced rough weather, the wind blowing strong from the northward, there being only 25 sails in sight. At 7 p.m., the weather clearing, we discovered the main body of the fleet to windward. Being now in the habit of pumping every hour at 10 p.m., discovered that the ship had sprung a fresh leak, and that there were 2 feet of water in the hold. After clearing the water, we found it requisite to pump every quarter of an hour, and I had some apprehensions that we should be forced to abandon the ship. During the night, a large flying fish fell on board. As the daylight appeared, the wind moderated, and we found ourselves, as customary, in the rear of the fleet. The 17th, at meridian, we could only see 4 vessels to windward, the wind blowing strong from the eastward and very hazy weather, pumping half-hourly under double-reefed topsails. The 18th, at 1 p.m., we experienced fresh gales with frequent squalls and rain. As the sun set, we could only see 5 vessels from the masthead. At 4 a.m., we had 2 of the fleet in company. I sent to the masthead, from which place 4 sails close together were discovered in the southwest quarter. I stood for them, our companions following us. At 8 a.m., we counted 106 vessels, and at meridian joined the fleet. The 19th, we had the pleasure of being abreast of the admiral, which was an unusual treat. At 9 p.m., our leak suddenly ceased, doubtless by drawing some substance into the hole. At 9 a.m., hoisted out our boat as the wind was light to procure some provisions from my acquaintance. I accordingly obtained 2 tierces of beef and 250 loaves of bread from the ship Uxbridge, and a keg of rum from the ship Mary, both of Liverpool. The former ship had brought to Kingston a cargo of lumber from Philadelphia, and on her passage near Santo Domingo, she had beat off a French privateer and arrived much damaged. Our sails had been so often split and mended that our canvas was nearly expended, and I had been under the necessity of using the men's hammocks to repair the damage. Before we hoisted in our boat, we scrubbed our ship's bends to remove the marine grass and barnacles growing thereon. The 20th of July, we were astern of the fleet. At 6 a.m., the Swan sloop of war came down to us and veered a hawser astern, requesting we would make it fast. We accordingly got a hold of it and exerted ourselves to make it firm, but before we could get it secured, they filled their sails and hurt my arm, and it was a great mercy that it was not jammed in pieces. The captain of the sloop of war informed me that the ship Britannia was so leaky after her sailing from Montego Bay that the captain had run her on shore on the Isle of Pines, and that the Success of Belfast had gone into Havana leaky. I informed him of 2 other vessels belonging to the Kingston division being missing, which he appeared ignorant of, and about 4 p.m. on the 21st ordered us to cast off the tow rope that he might speak to the admiral before night, and promised to see me again when I should want his assistance to tow us into the fleet. The 22nd of July, we were now approaching the banks of Newfoundland. We experienced foggy weather. This day we had a strong gale with frequent heavy squalls, and as we were uncertain how far we were astern of the main body of the fleet, we carried a press of sail, and were well exercised in reducing and extending our canvas to endeavor to keep up with the convoy. At 8 a.m. a heavy squall laid us nearly on our beam ends, its approach not being observed owing to the fog. As I was at my post watching the sails, I called loudly to let fly the main sheet, but no one being quick enough, and seeing the carpenter panic-struck, I was tempted to seize hold of his jacket and fling him to leeward to execute my orders. The sheet was accordingly cast off, and the sail immediately rent to pieces. By urging my carpenter to his duty, I had now laid myself open to the discipline of the gentlemen residing in Doctors' Commons, who give no allowances for any situation a master of a ship may be placed in to save the ship and cargo, as well as the lives of the crew, but they keep close to the letter of the law, embracing every advantage of the harassed and perplexed situation of the poor shipmaster. The 23rd saw a ship in the fleet that had lost her main and mizzen topmasts, perhaps in the storm of yesterday. This day we had fresh gales with squalls and very foggy weather. At 11 a.m. we passed several vessels at anchor on the Grand Bank of Newfoundland. The 24th we had a strong gale with frequent squalls from the south-southwest with heavy rain. At 7 p.m. we lay the ship to and got down the topgallant yards, a heavy sea running. At 8 p.m. a wave struck the after part of the ship, which threw the steersman over the wheel, but providentially his life was preserved, though much bruised. At midnight, the wind having shifted to the westward, we got our topsails and foresail. Whilst laying to, we got soundings on the bank in 34 fathoms. At daylight, on examining the rudder, we found it sprung in the rudder case. We therefore welded it with rope, and did our best to repair the damage. Having discovered the fleet hull down ahead, we made sail to endeavor to overtake our convoy. On the evening of the 25th, we overtook the Admiral, our ship being very leaky. From the 25th to the 30th, having moderate weather, we kept up with the fleet, and on this day the Admiral made a signal for all masters of merchant vessels about 8 a.m. Whilst our crew were busily employed in clearing our boat to hoist her out, the ship Thetis of London passed us, and informed me that I had no occasion to answer the signal, it being confined to those bound for Bristol and the St. George's Channel, which was good news for me, as I found myself very feeble. The 3rd of August we were obliged to pump every half hour, and the 4th and 5th we were left the sternmost of the fleet. The 6th we experienced very rough weather, but was obliged to carry a press of sail to keep the fleet in sight, though the waves were making a free passage over us, and our crew much fatigued at the pump, which now required almost constant attention to keep the water under. The convoy seemed to care little for the slow-sailing ships, but kept pushing on, and sometimes ran ahead out of sight. The 7th and 8th, the wind blowing strong with rain and thick weather. Towards meridian we spoke a ship, and was informed that we were in soundings, the depth 74 fathoms. My longitude by account being 7 degrees 46 minutes west, which will ascertain that my method of allowing for a constant easterly current is correct. As the Swan sloop was about 4 degrees astern of me when I last spoke her, I imagine she must have been 8 degrees to the westward on striking soundings, not having allowed for the easterly stream. Indeed, few navigators know anything of it, nor will they give themselves the trouble of enquiry, how their reckonings are so often erroneous. This day we had been just 10 weeks from Jamaica, and a signal was now made for the ships bound for the Bristol and St. George's channels to separate from the Admiral and proceed to their respective ports. On the morning of the 9th we discovered 3 line of battleships and a frigate coming into the fleet, one of which spoke our Admiral, and afterwards steered as the other ships. As we had now a strong convoy, the Europa took French leave, and made the best of her way for Portsmouth. The 10th and 11th being fine days, we employed our crew in repairing our shattered sails and rigging. The 12th found ourselves deserted by all the men of war. This day a Dover cutter came alongside, but the weather being foggy, we could not see the land. My passenger, being tired of the sea, agreed to give some guineas for the cutter to land him. It will be recollected that when this young man applied to me in Old Harbor to give him his passage to England, he represented himself in distress and without the means of paying for his passage. He could now find money to pay the cutter for taking him on shore and to defray his expenses to London. During our voyage he saw me frequently reading my Bible, and as he had imbibed principles of infidelity, he endeavored to ridicule the Scriptures, saying they had been proved a fabrication, erroneously translated from the original text to mislead the ignorant. And as a proof of their inconsistency, he informed me that the head of the Almighty was represented in one place as white as wool, and in another part as black as a raven. This representation staggered me, and I began to think all was not right, not being aware at that time that these descriptions were only figurative, and not to be taken as the literal sense. Towards evening, a sloop of war laying in wait for homeward-bound ships fired several shots at us, wantonly, to bring us to, when one gun would have answered every good purpose. But young men in arms are fond of hectoring over those from whom there is no danger of retaliation. 3 of my English seamen had previously hid themselves amongst the cargo before the boat boarded us, and as no British could be found, a Swede was taken. But after examination on board the man-of-war, he was sent back to me, and I was allowed to proceed up the English Channel. At Meridian, we saw the needlepoint plain. On the 13th at 2 p.m., the wind became variable, inclining to the eastward. I therefore thought it prudent to proceed to Spithead for a convoy. About dusk, we gained south of Yarmouth Road, within the Isle of Wight, and anchored near a Liverpool ship bound also for London. After dark, my mate was laying about the deck, drunk and helpless. Being a complete tippler, it was this man's practice, during our passage, to watch for my coming on deck, which as soon as he perceived, he hastened below to the rum bottle, and being on my guard, I used to detect him. One night in the dark he caught me in his arms, not knowing what he was doing, being generally what seamen term half-seas over. The 14th, the tide answering, at 2 past noon, we got under sail in company with the ship Mary, to work to windward for Spithead, the wind being light. We endeavored to decoy a shark to our fishhook, but it would not come near the ship. I saw the Europa laying at Spithead with yards and topmasts struck, and the Admiral was probably safe in London. 3 of my crew hired 3 fishermen from Ryde to proceed in the ship to London, to officiate on deck whilst their employers hid themselves in the hold from the press boats. The 16th, as we passed Hastings, we had a good view of the encampment in its vicinity. One of the boats from the town visited us with fish, but more particularly they were in quest of goods for smuggling, and were not a little disappointed at finding they had applied at the wrong shop. In the afternoon a Dover boat boarded us, and having inquired of our men whether our ship had received any damage on the passage, and having learned that the rudder was sprung, etc., they endeavored to persuade me to go into Dover to get the damage repaired, and that, if I would be governed by them, I should receive a handsome sum for myself. However, I resisted their dishonest advice, and dismissed them as rogues in grain. At daylight on the morning of the 17th, we rounded the South Foreland and stood for the Downs, where we discovered a Russian fleet of 16 men of war at anchor there. The 20th, we discharged our pilot at Gravesend, and obtained a pilot for the Pool. At 10 o'clock in the morning we weighed with the flood, and at 5 in the afternoon we anchored near the convict ship at Woolwich, having 2 custom house officers and 2 excise men on board from Gravesend to keep each other honest. This night my 3 British seamen landed on the Essex side and proceeded to London. The 21st, at 6 in the morning, we again made sail from above Woolwich. Soon after passing Blackwall, the pilot ran the ship on shore on the Isle of Dogs, but as the flood tide was running, we got her off by the help of a kedge anchor during a great fall of rain. Before sunset we entered the Pool. We had been 12 weeks from Jamaica, and as I had been sadly harassed during the whole time with a slow-sailing, leaky ship and an unprincipled crew, I was much rejoiced in finding myself safe in the Thames. The 22nd, we hauled the ship to the Guinea chain. My crew now demanded their run money. I informed them they should be paid as soon as I could ascertain the average sum that was given by the fleet. They therefore quitted the ship, and having made acquaintance on shore with men of bad character, I soon received several summonses from the proctors in Doctors' Commons. The 24th, we got our sails unbent by lumpers, and on going on board in the evening found the mate had taken French leave, who afterwards met me on the exchange, and civilly handed me a proctor's letter, and sneaked away like a dog with his tail cut. As my owners were desirous to pay the runs without trouble, I paid the amount of £383 5 shillings to the crew for 12 weeks' wages, each seaman receiving 45 guineas, whilst my wages in the same space of time did not amount to £15. While Mr. 1010 was in London, he received advice from Montego Bay that the whole of the cargo landed from the unfortunate ship Brothers had been consumed by fire and was a total loss. As I gave a very bad account of the condition of our ship, Mr. 1010 agreed to advertise her for sale as soon as possible. Accordingly, on exhibiting a broom at the masthead, many people came to inspect her. As my health continued to decrease, I applied to Mr. Hawes, an apothecary in Tooley Street, who gave me some medicine and requested me to use less exercise for a while. A person who came on board to inspect our ship about this time discovered the apron of her stern was decayed, and as this was a defect of great consequence, her bad condition was published far and wide. However, at the time appointed, she was put up for sale at Lloyd's Coffee House, and as no person would bid near the amount expected, she was bought in by the owners. About this time, my host, with whom I boarded in Liverpool, came to London on business, and invited me to dine with him at his sister's in the Borough, who was married to a surveyor in the Excise. I accordingly accepted the invitation, and as Mrs. J. saw that I was poorly, she invited me to stay at her house a few days, and she would use her endeavors to restore me to health again. I therefore agreed to sleep on shore a few nights, and she made me some beef tea to drink. On the Sabbath afternoon her husband proposed a walk, and conducted me to Kensington Gardens. We took tea with one of the household in St. James's Palace, and after drinking a glass or two of wine with a butler to a great man in office near Hyde Park, I returned to the Borough much fatigued and injured by my excursion, instead of being benefited by my walk. But I could have expected no other had I considered that I had been breaking the Sabbath. I had now been 17 years regularly at sea, exclusive of my first voyage to South Carolina with my father previous to the American War, and, on a rough calculation, I imagine I have sailed more than 100,000 miles on the Atlantic Ocean. During this time, I was never in a vessel that was stranded, wrecked, or that lost a mast by the board larger than a topmast, and believed that the underwriters never lost a sixpence by me during the whole of my seafaring life, which calls loudly on me for gratitude to my great preserver. I left school at the age of 14. I was then sent to sea, and for the first 4 years sailed in the Falmouth packets. Then I sailed about 3 years in the transport service, and during these several years I suffered innumerable hardships and ill treatment. The remainder of my sea life I spent in service of a merchant from the port of Liverpool. The first 3 years I was chief mate, and latter years I was shipmaster. At 15 years of age I earned my livelihood, and from this period never received 5 shillings as a gift from any relative, nor ever sailed from a port, to the best of my knowledge, 1 shilling in debt. I hope you enjoyed this final episode from the Journal of Samuel Kelly. Please like, subscribe, and follow on whatever platform you're listening. Be sure to check out the description to find out more ways you can support this project, and keep an eye out for other projects like this in the future.